So a big welcome to our listeners of The Responsible Edge. Welcome back for another show. Reminder, the Responsible Edge is brought to you by the Anti-Greenwash Charter. And today I am delighted to be joined by Mina Hasman. Mina, thank you so much for agreeing to give up your time this Wednesday morning and joining us for a show.
Thank you for inviting me, Charlie. It's my absolute pleasure to be here. I'm very much looking forward to our conversation today.
Fantastic. Now, Mina, you know that we have only got 20 minutes to sort of go through you and your background, and there's a lot to pack in. So I won't do my normal ramble here, but I'll just say, start wherever you like, but just give our listeners who aren't aware of your work a flavor as to who you are and the things that you've done so far in your career.
Of course, I'll be happy to. And perhaps I'll start where I am today, and I can give a bit of a history to why I'm here today. First of all, I'm an architect and environmental engineer, and in my day job, the sustainability director at the global design practice of Skidmore, Owings Merrill. For those who may not know who SOM is, we're an interdisciplinary global practice where we have architects, environmental engineers, mechanical engineers, engineering of any kind, urban planners, interior designers, all working together, which is what excites me about SOM, and which is the reason why I joined the firm almost 13 years ago. I'm currently based in their London office, and I have been leading their projects from a sustainability perspective, if I can crudely describe it that way. So I get a chance, I think I'm very blessed, I get a chance to work on our interior design, architecture, urban planning projects, and sort of give a bit of a nudge to push the agenda of sustainability in all of those, even though this is very much at the ethos and at the heart of SOM's work. How I came here, and not necessarily to SOM, but how I am in this sort of sustainability role today is actually goes back to, I don't want to walk you through my entire life history, but I think it really actually, now that I consciously realize that I was always very passionate, interested about sustainability, even as a child. I'm originally from Turkey. And when we were in preliminary school, I was about 7 years old. We went to Cappadocia. That was our school trip. And I remember how it was in the middle of the summer, so it was very hot. But I don't know if you know the sort of structures of the Cappadocia, where there are these sort of earthen cave homes and sort of, I guess, structures. And I remember visiting them and being very cold inside when it was so hot outside. So I didn't understand how I could feel, cold when there's no air conditioner or anything like that. And then that sort of instigated, I guess, an interest in me to understand how buildings work and how environments sort of interact with nature and so forth. And I think that was unconsciously when I realized I would interest in sustainability. And just to say that later on, I ended up studying architecture. And when I was studying architecture at Cornell University, one of our visiting professors, Kevin Pratt, who is the main reason why I'm here today, who unfortunately passed away at a very young age, but he was so passionate about sustainability and talked about sustainable design so passionately also himself that I was very much inspired and in awe of everything that he was teaching us. So I said, I want to go to London. I was sitting in the US at the time. I want to go to London, study at the same school he studied, which is what I did at the Architecture Association. And I was taught by the same professor, Simos Yanas, decades later. And I've been trying to nurture my passion for sustainability with the work that I do at SOM and beyond.
I mean, that was so beautifully introduced, and you provided such a nutshell there of many kind of incredible things that you've done so far. But just touch on that. That's an amazing thing to have been that inspired by a guest lecturer that you chose to sort of follow in his footsteps. Just give us, for those that don't know about, it was Stephen, wasn't it? Stephen's work.
His name was Kevin Pratt.
Kevin, sorry.
Yeah.
Just give us a flavor about what Kevin's work involved.
At Cornell, Cornell had a very traditional architectural sort of education system. So we learned about histories and theories of architecture, which I was completely mesmerized by it already. But there wasn't a single other professor that really talked about how we can intelligently design built environments, buildings, master plan cities and so forth in response to local context and local climate. And Kevin did that. So he said, we have a project. You cannot just design any building to fit anywhere in the world. They need to be designed, they need to be contextualized, and they need to be designed to respond to the local context needs, as well as responding to the needs of the end users. So you cannot design a building that's going to be an office for office users or for residents. They need to be designed differently because the end users' needs are different. So you need to treat it with the same mindset that the local context will be different. You cannot design a building that is with a certain aesthetic, certain form, certain shape, certain window sizes in, let's say, in Canada versus in the Middle East. They will have different climatic needs, and so the building needs to respond to that local climate and local context. And he did not only talk about that, but he also talked about how there are tools that we can use to help inform our design decisions. And he was talking about the importance of science-based decision-making and data-driven decision-making. And at the time, and this is a very long, many years ago, almost 20 years ago, when I was studying, there wasn't, none of the tools that we use today were available. There was, I remember I think the world's first parametric tool at the time, I think it was called generative components that we used, where we could plug in the solar altitude and solar information on that project specific site, pulling the information from satellite sort of data to help inform how the sun hits the building that we're designing, for example. And then he would guide us to understand what we're seeing in front of our eyes, using this tool, and informing the design decisions, for example, understanding where the windows should be placed in, where there is no sun coming in, because the project was in Dubai. This project that we're designing was in Dubai. So we wanted to mitigate the sun coming in to the building and so forth. So it was fascinating. And so in the project, I think that we worked on also is what had enabled me to understand how perhaps what is often theory-based sort of knowledge sharing that happens in education and how that can be applied in real life. Of course, we did not build a real project, but because we follow this sort of almost like design or science-based or data-driven decision-making process, even very crudely at school in the design of this building, we were able to really understand the impact of it when we went to Dubai. We did a site visit in Dubai, and so that we could understand how warm it is and what true sort of environmental considerations we need to put into our thinking by visiting the project site. Because we could see, for example, on paper, and from the software, we could understand how hot it is and how strong the sun is and so forth. But then when you're on site there, you really feel it. So it's not just understanding it on paper, but also feeling it in the context is what has, I think, helped us inform decisions that we made in the design of that one particular project.
It's so interesting, Mina. We've had shows recently where guests have talked about like the impact of the sensory experience of things and talking about kind of formative experiences that inspired them to think about sustainability or think about environmentalism or whatever else it might be. And the role the impact of that sensory experience can have upon not just, as you say, things on paper, but ultimately how you're going to address these or your inspiration to address these challenges moving forward. On that point, you beautifully described, being a very perceptive 7-year-old stood in a cave, realizing the impact of the different climate conditions from being inside to outside. In terms of sustainability, in terms of environmentalism, because I'm making an assumption there that it was the environmental side of sustainability. It was your kind of first real passion, if you like. Just talk us through like when that sort of presented itself to you and whether or not there were any particular sort of experiences that you can recall that really shone a light for you on why this was such a big problem, why this was such a big issue, and why it was something that ultimately you wanted to address with the work that you were doing.
Yeah, no, that's a brilliant question, Charlie, and a difficult one perhaps to unpack, but I'll do my best. I think one is the environmental aspect of sustainability is often what we in the industry focus on. And I think that because that's most tangible and that's more visible and immediate. Also from a sensory perspective, as you mentioned before. And I, my interest started subconsciously or unconsciously at the time, but now more consciously as the years passed on. From that one experience that I had in Cappadocia, moving forward, I started becoming much more perceptive of my environment, my surroundings. And also that's the reason why I wanted to study architecture. but still not knowing, even though while I was studying architecture, not knowing the impact the climate had on architecture as much as, until I met Kevin and taken his studio. Of course, there's vernacular architecture and so forth that we've been thought about at school, where vernacular architecture is all about responding to local climate and context. So that has always been in the back of my mind, but I realized more and more that if we could, maybe this is before any of these sort of climate change and biodiversity crisis and declarations that have happened over the last few years. Even before all of that, I realized how important it is for us to sustainably really take the most of what we are given by the planet and use it in the most conscious and sustainable manner, because these resources are limited. I think maybe not every young person had this sort of consciousness, but I was very aware of the fact that, one day we may not have water, one day we may not have, enough, sun. And, there are things, because like the nature is a living organism. Like we cannot predict. The planet is a living entity. We cannot predict how it's going to behave. And we should not make an assumption that everything will be there, forever. And maybe this is a very personal note, but maybe I should just mention this. I think subconsciously, the reason why I am sort of made in this way, and I think of this way, is because my father went bankrupt when I was much younger. So, we went from having a lot of things to not having nothing. And maybe that made me realize that, you may not have everything one day. You may wake up one day and then not have everything. And so that's the reason why I wanted to go down this path. And I'm only putting everything together now, even with your question, because I think a lot of puzzle pieces come together, but there is a reason of why a certain person goes down one path. And you can probably guess, like the way that I talk about my job in general or about sustainability is I truly believe in it. And it's my passion. It's not my job. My job is my life, because I actually truly believe in what I do. And I'm really blessed to have the opportunity to work at SOM, which enables me to nurture this passion and to give back and to add value. Maybe also to conclude your question from that perspective is that I think now there is a very clear evidence. Now I take it away from me as Mina, but there's a clear evidence in the industry of how we can, first of all, we can meaningfully make an impact, positive impact to address climate change with the work that every single person does within the built environment sector. And what are the tools to be used, and what sort of how do we define value? How do we measure impact and so forth? There's everything, I think, currently available within our arsenal that can enable us to really understand how we can make an impact. And I think we just need to be mindful that the decisions we take today is not just for that one project and not for this moment in time or not for the next 5 years, but it's for the next century. And I think if we can embed that mindset of like longer term responsibility, longer term accountability, then every decision we take will be much more carefully considered. So maybe I'll stop here.
Mina, I love it. You've literally just gone way ahead, and almost, I think it was yesterday that I had a podcast and somebody used their magic wand to talk about ensuring long-term thinking was an absolute norm when it comes to a completely different context. But it's interesting. You've jumped straight. You've got to magic wand already. Before we head on to talk about today's article, I've got a couple more questions about you and your career. What would, you've been very successful already in what you've done, and clearly the passion that you've got for your work it comes through really clearly. And I love how you described it as, I don't have a job, I work, I essentially realize my passion every day. I think that's wonderful. What would the rest of, if you were to be successful over the rest of your career from this point onwards, what would you do? What would the impact be of your work? Like, how would you describe, the future?
My dream is to scale my impact beyond the one person I am. And that's very evident, hopefully, in the work that I try to do both at SOM and also beyond SOM, because I by myself, and I believe that this is the case for any human being on this planet and also any organization, individual organization on this planet, is that they cannot solve the challenges we have ahead from multiple perspectives, not just from climate change, biodiversity crisis, but, social, economic, and, many parameters and challenges that we're collectively facing and will inevitably continue to face. They cannot be solved by one entity or one individual person. So I always strive, and this will be forever, I think until the day I die forever, my mission is to be able to influence, inspire others to scale the impact, the positive impact we can do collectively. And I think that's my mission that I will work forever for.
And out of interest, just on that point, what can you pinpoint any specific things that you're working on at the moment in order to realize that? Is there any, I know you do lots of things. Are you mentoring? Are you what are the sorts of things that you're doing in order to stimulate that kind of inspiration that you've described there?
And I have met many people who did not understand or did not appreciate the power of climate advocacy. But I try to be out there, try to speak for the things that matter, not to me only, but to many of us, or every one of us, hopefully around the world. And not just to speak, to inspire others, but to demonstrate that there are solutions out there. And I think the least any one of us can do is to share knowledge, share sort of examples, failures, successes. And that's what I'm trying to do. And that's the umbrella of the climate advocacy, which is what I do at SOM, within our London office, within our 14 offices across the firm, when I'm outside also industry, as well as academia. So I teach. I took a bit of a break because I went on maternity leave about 2 years ago, but I teach normally at the UCL, the Bartlett, at their MEng program, which is a combined architecture engineering degree. And also I teach also at the environment engineering master's program at the UCL as well. And I also try to do a lot of lectures and so forth at the Manchester School of Architecture, which I'm giving a lecture tomorrow. So try to be connected to the students, to the next generation of built environment decision makers. I don't want to say necessarily professionals, but decision makers. And I'm hoping that in every instance of a conversation, whether it be a 15-minute studio crit that I may do at the UCL, or whether it be 1 hour lecture, which I'm going to give tomorrow at the Manchester School of Architecture, or anything, I just want to make sure that I can deliver one message, and hopefully as they walk away from that conversation with me, they can be inspired to do more within the work that they do, and even do more to impact others. So it's almost, I'm trying to create a domino effect, or like a chain reaction. With every conversation. That's why I value every conversation we have. And that's why I value this conversation very much, because you're giving me an opportunity to reach a wider audience, that I may just be able to reach by myself. So that's what I do for the students in the next generation. But I think for the younger generation, maybe not just students. And then I'm also trying to look at from the other side of the spectrum and try to bring together those that are already in power of making key decisions. Those are all the almost like I call them like the adults of our adult actors of our industry, whether they be professional institutes or academics. Those are that are doing research or teaching in schools. So I try to bring them together to help create this chain reaction. In my current, and maybe I can give one I wear multiple hats in various organizations that I voluntarily contribute on top of my day job to be able to do this. But I think the one immediate example I can give is that I was lucky enough to be elected as the chair of the UK's Construction Industry Council, where we are working as the Climate Change Committee, which I'm chairing. We're working together with the leading UK professional institutes and industry bodies to help advance a certain agenda items, climate literacy being one of them, accountability and verification on carbon being the second one, and then lobbying the government being the third of our sort of key ambitions that we want to do collectively.
And Mina, I asked you what you were doing in order to influence minds and hearts, if you like, and you just reeled off an exceptional number of hats that you've got on. I want to ask you a question about that. You mentioned that you've recently become a mother. You've obviously got many other requirements of your time. How do you go about deciding what to commit your time to? You presumably have got so many options and so many things available to you. And just talk us through like how you go about analyzing what to get involved with and what not to.
Thank you, Charlie. I think that's a great question, and one that I get asked a lot because on paper, you see I'm involved in 20 different organizations. They're like, how do you even have time? But, it's true. Maybe on paper I am, but meaning that, and I would never commit to anything that I cannot fully deliver. And that's why, especially after becoming a parent, I realized that it's important to prioritize what I can do most, and prioritize also what sort of ambitions I can set within the organizations that I can be involved in. And I think over the years, what I have been doing strategically is to really be able to build the right foundations to be able to narrow down, filter, and prioritize now that I'm in this place. Because I always knew I wanted to be a parent, and I knew that I was going to have a limited time to do all the things that I want to do. I think what the immediate answer to your question is that there are certain things that I'm truly passionate about. And under the umbrella of sustainability, there's so much that one can focus on. But I'm very passionate about climate literacy, because I think that knowledge is at the basis of the foundations of how we define success of our future. And building that right knowledge and enabling individuals with the right knowledge to build skills, which will come in with experiences, is, I think, what's going to help us succeed holistically, consistently, and at a mainstream level. So, for example, even though I wear multiple hats in different organizations, I always champion climate literacy, for example. Like I champion one key element so that and what I do is that I bring different perspectives from these different organizations and individuals that are involved with these different organizations to help refine the roadmap and to define the key actions to get to that end goal, whatever it may be. For example, mandating CPDs within the professional institutes to bring climate literacy to a certain level. If that's our end goal, is how can we get there, is the conversations I'm having with everyone in these different organizations that I'm working with or under. But it's just one topic. I'm giving the example for clarity, but climate literacy is the key one.
I'm with you. So it's almost again to sort of summarize back to you, it's the sense that yes, you're involved with lots of organizations. Yes, you've got lots of hats on, but ultimately there's some commonality in terms of focus and threads, if you like, that are applied to these multiple organizations. Well, Mina, I would say, and I'm sure our listeners would agree with me, that you sound like absolute superwoman with all that you're involved in and managing. So it's a great inspiration, I think, to people out there to know that, if you are passionate enough, if you care enough about what you're doing, but also if you're intentional and you're clear about what you can commit and what you can't, then you can manage, multiple different, opportunities, if you like, at once. And you obviously are doing it fantastically. Mina, I know we've just scratched the surface in terms of talking about you, and I feel like I could ask you questions about you all day. Perhaps we might get you back on for another show where we find another chapter. But for now, let's move on perhaps to the article by Jess Hiranak, which I probably butchered. Apologies, Jess. In the Architects Journal from I think October last year. Would you mind just summarizing the article for our listeners and then perhaps picking out whatever the most interesting points were for you from the piece?
Thank you. And Charlie, I should also mention that thank you for picking this particular article because of my colleague and friend Jess Hiranak, because she's been absolutely brilliant in sort of succinctly describing the ambitions behind the UK net zero carbon building standards in this article. And I know how much work she's put into the sort of development of the standard. And I know this firsthand because I've been also involved in the creation of the standard, leading the stakeholder engagement for the standard across the nation. But just going back to this article, which I think has come out quite timely, with the launch of the pilot version of the world's first net zero carbon building standard. It is true that it is the world's first standard that really defines a clear and standardized criteria for net zero carbon buildings in the UK. But I can also, wearing multiple hats and working in global practice, I know that the standard is inspiring other nations, other countries to develop their own standards.
Awesome.
And so this particular article is really describing the sort of the ambitions behind the standard, which is setting energy and carbon limits and targets to enable the UK real estate sector to decarbonize and to stay within the nation's defined carbon energy budgets. And it is, I think, just to highlight that it is a brilliant piece of work because it's the work that is not done by one individual. I talked about the importance of collaboration, and it's probably one of the largest cross-industry collaboration that has taking place in the industry over the last few years in the UK, especially bringing together a coalition of organizations, including the Better Buildings Partnership, the UK Green Building Council, LETI, RIBA, and SIPSI, and others. And there were over 350 professionals that contribute to the creation of the standard for over 2 years that they worked on very much in sync and collaboration, as I mentioned before. And I think just to emphasize that I believe that this is a very much a needed and unified approach within our industry to help define these clear and science-based performance metrics where people can measure their projects against, or their, the built assets against, to help inform the roadmap of net zero carbon in the UK for the built environment sector.
Mina, that was absolute, as expected. That was an absolutely brilliant description and summary of the article. I should say for our listeners, we will link to Jess's article so you yourselves can go and dive into it and learn a bit more about the new standard and its formation. Mina, I want to pick up on, though, we're going to talk about the carbon, the issue of decarbonisation within the built environment itself in a moment, but again, one of those most common themes that comes up on the responsible edge is this whole notion of collaboration and partnership across industries and sectors. You've just described how this is probably one of the best examples, if you like, of the built environment sector in the UK really coming together. Can you just describe to us like what your experience has typically been like, obviously working with multiple different hats on stimulating kind of partnership and collaboration within the built environment sector? Do you think it's doing well overall to do these sorts of things, or do you think there's more work that can be done?
I think we have gone, and I speak when I say we as part of the industry, I think we have gone a long way to help promote greater collaborations and partnerships in the industry, especially over the last few years, specifically around the topic of decarbonization, because I think many people are, if they haven't already a few years ago, now realizing that this is too big of a responsibility to shoulder on our own. And also it's too big of an ask to really deliver sustainable, measurable outcomes and to get to that end goal of net zero carbon by 2050. But I think there can be more done on this. And the reason why I say this is because, first-hand experiences I talked about my passion about climate literacy, and something that we've been championing in the industry is to get all of the leading professional institutes, I'm giving an example, I think, to help clarify my point, to have at least mandatory continuing education or training requirements for those practicing in the industry today against certain topics of under the number of climate change, so that everyone can become climate literates, not experts, but literates across the industry. But over the years, this still hasn't been reality, unfortunately. And the reason for it is because even though the intent is there and the willingness to collaborate is there, there's still a lot of sense of people wanting to own something, claim something, I think there's a bit of this protectiveness that people want to still have for their organizations, for the business case to perhaps increase their reputation or make more money. And I don't know what it is. There are multiple parameters, but I think there is still this sense of, I did it, or it's us, or, we're leading, or I think we still haven't gotten around that, to remove that from our minds, to say, it's not about one leading organization. It may be inevitably one leading or a couple of them, but it's about us collectively getting there. And I think if I could, I'm not sure if I'm describing this clearly, but I think that's the reason why we're not as collaborative as we could be in the industry. And I mean that both from industry and academic collaboration perspective, within the industry perspective, private and public sector perspective, there are many opportunities of collaboration that is not happening in the same with the same sort of ambitions that, for example, the standard is exemplifying here.
So essentially, let's all get our egos out the way and not worry about being the front page, and let's get the stuff done. Yeah. You mentioned the standard. I'm referring to it as the standard because I think trying to reel off the acronym of NZCBS is a bit too much every time. But what was it, do you think, about what that standard was trying to achieve that actually provided the condition for everybody to come together and collaborate as they did?
I think because all the sort of leading organizations that are behind the standard, that are equally and collectively developing the standard, have been developing over the last few years, as I mentioned before, and continue to do so. They have all individually been looking at this topic of how are we going to decarbonize? How are we going to enable our members, because they're mostly member organizations or professional bodies, as I mentioned before, how are we going to enable our members to decarbonize at scale and fast? Yes, we can decarbonize if we had, centuries or decades to do so, but we don't have that much time. We have 30 years or so, but that's not enough even to deliver this sort of ambition of net zero carbon at scale. And I think, as I mentioned before, many organizations have been sort of implanting seeds, I think, within their own organizational efforts to be able to do this. But they realize that if there isn't a unified approach across the industry, which there wasn't until the standards launch, then we cannot really measure progress. And if we cannot measure progress, then we cannot really help inform the next step of actions or the roadmap truly to get there. We can all do the best what we can within our own limits as individual organizations. But if we don't collectively speak the same language, understand what good looks like, meaning that measure our successes as an industry collectively, because no one is measuring any organization's success on its own. We're measured as an industry, right? So that is what led to the creation of this coalition that has worked to create the standard. And I think it was very clear for everyone that if we cannot join forces, then we will never be able to truly understand where we stand, which means that we will never be able to truly inform the next steps of actions.
Beautifully responded to, as I may say so, Mina. You're an absolute podcaster's dream, I have to say, and you've done a lot of this sort of stuff. Let me ask you though. You mentioned a couple of really interesting themes in that response. Obviously, this is a voluntary adoption at the moment. I know that the standard only launched in September. What's uptake been like? How much of an impact is the standard having already?
Since it's launched, there is definitely a greater awareness around it. And this was intentional by the group that is working behind the standard. I'm helping them together with the chair of the standard, David Partridge, to help disseminate the standard as much as possible through stakeholder engagements that we've been doing, dedicated workshops that we've been doing, and so forth with various, as we call them, affinity groups. So there has been a much greater awareness of the standard and the intent and the details of the standard. The intent behind it and the details of it. And right now, it's actually the pilot phase is going to start soon. And actually, even though the deadline to submit pilot projects was last week, I think there's a bit more space and room for anyone who is interested. And if I can take this opportunity to do a call to action for anyone interested in piloting their projects against the standards, requirements, and methodologies and framework, please do submit your interest to the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standards website. Because this is the critical phase to really help not only raise more awareness on the standard, but also to help understand how the standard can be implemented in day-to-day practice. Because it's one thing having a standard that says this is what good looks like, this is the process you should follow, and this is the methodology and so forth. But how is that implemented in practice, and what kind of barriers, challenges, opportunities there may exist while working with the standards or aligned with the standard is going to help inform how the standards should be further refined and shaped before it gets launched again at the end of this year.
Oh, I see. Okay, so a period of reflection, and then exactly. The standard will be finalized towards the end of this year. Well, I mean, a great suggestion for anybody out there that wants to get involved and contribute to the pilot. Again, we'll include links to relevant places so that we can share that with our audience too. Mina, let's talk about, if I may, draw the attention now towards the impact of a standard like this, and in particular with obviously our area of real interest, I think, with the work that we're doing at the Charter. What impact is the creation of something like this likely to have upon the way that organizations go about within the built environment communicating their carbon credentials, if you like, of their project work?
A great question again, Charlie. I think the standard is definitely setting the right foundations for preventing greenwash and for sort of eliminating any kind of claims of net zero carbon that cannot be truly substantiated by evidence. And the standard is a significant step towards sort of accountability in the built environment. I think it's going to shift, even though people may or may not choose to use the standard today because it's voluntary, as you mentioned before. It's definitely is signaling a shift within the industry to change the mindset of to individuals that are working today in the industry, that their responsibility is not for today. Their responsibility is not limited within the boundaries of their contract, of their project, but their responsibility goes beyond that one project, that one scope, that one contract, that one boundary. I think it's that shift of mindset is going to instill a greater sense of responsibility and accountability in the industry, to work towards measurable outcomes and to claim net zero carbon or anything else that they want to claim based on evidence-based or data-informed outcomes rather than what we aspire to achieve or what we aim to achieve. I think it's always good to have those aspirations, but now it's time that the standard is saying that you need to make sure those aspirations become a reality. And I think this is going to help change the industry's processes, and then the sort of the way that the industry is working significantly, because we work very linearly in the industry. We currently do, our roles are very defined of architects, engineers, and so forth. And we go from one task to another without even often looking at what we've done in the previous phase of a project, for example. So there's no feedback loop often. I'm generalizing this perhaps rightly or wrongly, but there is no feedback loops that we're closing to make our work better in general. But the standard is saying you need to close those feedback loops, because we need to make sure what you may set as an ambition becomes a reality at this, ambition at design stage becomes a reality, at construction stage becomes a reality in real life and throughout the life of the building. So that we don't see these huge performance gaps that the industry is saying between design and real constructed buildings.
Mina, the phrase "let's get real" comes to mind when thinking about the way that we disclose these things. Two questions for you on the built environment industry as a whole, touching or related to the article, and then we'll move on to Magic Wand. The first one is greenwashing related. How prevalent, how much of a problem is greenwashing in the built environment sector, in your experience?
I think it is a problem. It is a problem, and I don't think people do it intentionally. Maybe I'm naive, and I always want to see the things from the positive side. I don't think anyone greenwashes consciously. I think they do it because they don't know what they're claiming, what they're talking about, or like what they're what they're stating. Mm-hmm. They don't understand the implications of that statement, or they don't understand. I think many people to this date, and I say I get surprised, but also I shouldn't. Many people still to this day don't know what net zero carbon truly means, like what that entails and how do we unpack it, how do we measure it, how do we claim it eventually, that headline title, for lack of a better description. And I think that's why it's still a problem that there is greenwashing happening. But I don't think it's happening vastly or as vastly as, again, maybe I'm positive and hopeful. And whenever it's happening, I think the intent is often is because, or not the intent, but the reason often is because they don't know that they're actually greenwashing, because they don't understand what, let's say, net zero carbon is.
Which takes us back to your key focus of improving carbon literacy across the industry and the importance of that. It's fascinating. We're actually we're now working with carbon literacy projects training provider to deliver to our signature of the charter. So very much sort of aligned on that front, Mina. Final question before we move on to Magic Wand. You've mentioned 2050 a couple of times, and obviously the industry's goals and objectives. How confident are you? You're an optimistic individual. Talk to us about how confident or not you are that we're going to hit those targets for 2050.
I still want to say that we can hit those targets, but I say with a big but for now, because, and I say that with a big but, unfortunately, because I see the sort of the great progress that has been made in the industry over the last few years, but not enough progress. Mm-hmm. There's great progress, but not at scale. I talked about the needing to do this progress at scale because of the urgency of the time. I'm hoping that now with the standard, especially with the standard, there is even clearer sort of pathway to that net zero carbon target by 2050. And we just need to make sure that everyone gets trained better, I think, not only to enable embedding standard in their day-to-day work, but also to be able to speak the same language within the industry, which I say we still don't do that. And then also to really use the tools that is within our arsenal. And standard is a great tool, is the tool for now to be used. And if we can all get behind the standards, then I think that then we can consistently bring progress and deliver measurable outcomes at scale. Even if we may not hit net zero carbon in our projects today, at least we'll know that we will enable those buildings that we're designing today to be net zero carbon. I think that's maybe one thing I should also emphasize. Many people say that, in today's norm, it's not possible to meet net zero carbon without carbon offsets for many reasons, especially for large scale projects. And I can put my hand up and say, yes, it is true to a certain extent. And I work on very large scale projects where embodied carbon is inevitably going to be there. And we cannot get to net zero carbon on that project site from an embodied carbon perspective, let's say. But that shouldn't discourage individuals such as myself, or that shouldn't discourage the industry, because even if we don't get it there today, if we can enable that building, that asset to be net zero carbon ready for when the technologies come in place to help bring that development, that building to net zero carbon, then I think we have really even done a huge a success. We have achieved a huge success. Like even enabling the building to get there is a big success, even though we may not be able to get that building to be net zero carbon today. And I think that's what people don't realize. They say, I cannot meet it today, so I'm not going to even bother. But I think, no, you should bother, because you're setting the foundations of what the future of the built environment is going to look like by 2050 for a building that you may be designing today in the next 5 years. It's still going to be standing by 2050. And it's still going to be accounted for within when we talk about the built environment sector's impact in our economy from a net zero carbon perspective.
Here, Mina. What a brilliant call to arms. I have to admit, as you were describing that, and I just sort of summarize or reflect back that there's a nuance, if you like, to what you've just described there. It reminds me of your experience in the way you described working with Kevin, and the fact that Kevin was a guy who looked at the small details, looked at the context, looked at framing things in a slightly different light, and you can clearly see that you're thinking that way as well. So it's amazing to see that commonality, if you like, in the way that you two both approach things. Mina, can you believe we've rattled through 12 minutes, and it's been absolutely brilliant. Would you mind finishing now with the magic wand question? So I'll ask you, Mina, if I was to hand you a magic wand and you could change one thing about the commercial world this instant, what would that one thing be?
There are so many. Let me see which one from my wish list I should pick. I think the one that is realistically doable tomorrow, I'm going to pick that, because I'm going to pick that, and it's climate literacy. I think if we could all have the same level of awareness and knowledge, again, not subject matter experts, we don't need to be, but we had the same level of awareness and knowledge around topics that are under the umbrella of climate change or sustainability. I'm describing this very crudely, and understand the interlinkages that exist between these topics. So it's not about getting to net zero carbon, but understanding the impact that while we make a decision to get a building to be net zero carbon, for example, those decisions are going to have an impact on health and well-being of the people. Mm-hmm. Those decisions are going to have an impact on water. Those decisions are going to have an impact on ecology and biodiversity and so forth. So understanding these interlinkages between priority areas, which we need to hit all, because we're not just in a climate emergency, but we're also in biodiversity emergency. We're also in people's emergency to a certain extent, an economic emergency. So there are many parameters. If we can understand that they all link to each other, so that we can avoid doing unintended consequences. And I think that's the one worry I have when we say, let's get behind, for example, net zero carbon building standard, and let's get all of our buildings to be net zero carbon. That's great, but mindful that on that journey, our decisions may be detrimental to other priority areas that we need to equally address under the umbrella of climate change. And I think that's the reason why I say climate literacy, and climate literacy.
Mina, that was absolutely fantastic. What a brilliant suggestion and use of the magic wand. And as you say, one that seems obtainable. We've had a few magic wands that really have tried to pull on the magic element of the wand. You've gone for something a little bit more practical and achievable. Mina, it's been an absolute joy having you on this morning. Thank you so much for easing me through some potentially some fairly complex concepts. And you've been absolutely brilliant this morning.
Thank you so much. It's been absolutely lovely talking to you, Charlie. And I do hope this is just the beginning of many conversations we'll have in the future.
Well, now you've said it on camera and on recording, I will have to get you back on. Mina, thank you very much again.
Happy to. Thank you so much.
And that's it for today's episode of The Responsible Edge. A huge thank you to Mina Hasman, Sustainability Director at SOM and a global advocate for climate action in the built environment. Mina was an absolutely fantastic guest. And today we explored insights from the article, Greenwashers Beware, Net Zero Carbon Buildings Have Been Defined, discussing how the new UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard is set to challenge greenwashing and drive real accountability in sustainable construction. As a reminder, this episode was brought to you by the Anti-Greenwash Charter, championing responsible sustainability communications. Visit antigreenwashcharter.com to learn more. I'm Charlie Martin. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. See you next time.